High in the merciless peaks of the Wyoming Rockies, where the wind screamed like a grieving widow and the snow swallowed whole forests without apology, there lived a man the valley folk only whispered about. His name was Gideon Crowe, though most simply called him the Grizzly. They said he had the shoulders of a draft horse, the temper of a thunderstorm, and eyes so cold they could freeze a river mid-current. Ha ha ha, some would laugh nervously in the saloon, claiming he was more beast than man, but none of them dared climb the mountain to prove it. It was November of 1887 when the storm came early. Gideon was returning to his cabin, boots sinking deep into drifts that reached his knees, his long rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. The wind lashed his face raw, but he barely blinked. Pain was an old companion. 10 years earlier, a foolish quarrel in Kansas had ended with a man dead and Gideon walking away with a limp that sang every winter. Since then, he had chosen the mountain over mankind. Solitude never betrayed you. When he reached the clearing where his cabin stood against a granite wall, something felt wrong. The chimney was silent, no smoke, no warmth. His jaw tightened. He never let the fire die. The oak door hung slightly ajar, groaning on its hinges as if warning him. Gideon didn't shout, he didn't ask questions, he simply cocked his Winchester. The metallic click echoed like a death sentence. He kicked the door open. The air inside was frozen, the stove cold, shadows clung to the corners like secrets. He scanned the room slowly, carefully, until his eyes fell on his bunk. There was a shape beneath the buffalo hides. He stepped closer, heart steady as stone, and yanked the blanket back. Not a bandit, not a drifter, a woman, small, starved, shivering so violently her teeth chattered like loose bones. Her hair was a wild cascade of copper, tangled with snow and pine needles. Her skin looked nearly translucent, stretched tight over hollow cheeks. She whimpered, not a scream, not a word. Just a broken, fragile sound that made something twist deep inside him. Gideon lowered the rifle. He knelt beside her and pressed his bare hand to her forehead, burning hot, yet her fingers were ice. Her eyes flew open, green. Terrified, she scrambled backward, pressing herself against the wall, trying to make herself smaller. Her lips parted as if to scream, but no sound came out, only a dry gasp. "Easy," Gideon muttered, raising both hands. "You're safe." "This is my cabin, safe." The word felt strange on his tongue. She stared at him like a deer cornered by wolves. He realized what she saw, a giant in furs, scar slicing down his jaw, beard thick and wild. A monster from children's nightmares. "I ain't going to hurt you," he said, softer now. "You're half dead from hunger." Her eyes flicked to the cold stove. Without another word, Gideon turned his back to her, a deliberate show of trust, and began building a fire. The kindling caught, flames licking upward, light dancing across the logs. He warmed water, shaved dried venison into a tin cup, made broth thin but hot. When he offered it, her trembling fingers brushed his calloused palm. She drank too fast and coughed, choking, tears spilling from the strain. "Slow," he said gently. When she finally lowered the cup, he asked, "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Nobody," she whispered hoarsely. "I'm nobody." A sad, broken laugh almost escaped him. Nobody didn't climb 8,000 feet into a blizzard without reason. Nobody didn't have bruises blooming dark around her wrists like a man's grip. "You ain't nobody," he said quietly. "Not up here." Silence settled between them, heavy but not cruel. After a long pause, she whispered, "My name is Elara." Elara. The moment she said it, something shifted in the room, in him. The storm howled outside, sealing them together in that 12 by 12 cabin high above the world. Gideon didn't know it yet, but the quiet life he had buried himself in was about to be torn open. And this starving stranger would become the reason he picked up his rifle again. Before we go further, if stories like this stir something in you, if you feel that chill in your spine and that ache in your chest, make sure you like this story. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you won't want to, because by morning the storm wouldn't be the only thing hunting on that mountain. For 3 days the storm raged like the heavens had declared war. Snow buried the cabin nearly to the roof, and the wind battered the logs so fiercely that Elara would flinch at every violent gust. Gideon pretended not to notice, but he always shifted slightly closer to the stove when she startled, just enough so she wouldn't feel alone. She slept most of the first 2 days. When she didn't, she drifted in and out of fevered murmurs. "No, please, I didn't mean to," she would whisper, tears slipping from the corners of her eyes even in sleep. Gideon kept his distance at first. He sharpened his knife, oiled his rifle, mended a trap that didn't need mending. Anything to avoid looking at the fragile thing in his bunk, but every time she whimpered, something tugged at him. On the third evening, the storm quieted. The sudden silence felt louder than the wind ever had. Elara finally managed to sit upright. Her color had improved slightly, though she still looked like a strong breeze might carry her away. She had washed her face with the basin water he left out. Her copper hair was braided loosely over one shoulder. "You stare at the fire like it owes you money," she said softly. Gideon glanced at her. "Fire's honest. Burns what you give it." She studied the scar that cut along his jaw. "And people, they burn worse." A faint smile flickered across her lips. It vanished quickly. He noticed the bruises on her wrists had darkened into ugly yellow-green patches. There were others too, half hidden beneath the collar of his oversized shirt she wore. "Who did that?" he asked bluntly. Her fingers instinctively covered her wrists. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." The words slipped out before he could stop them. She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for mockery, finding none. "I worked at the Ashford Ranch," she finally said, voice trembling. "For Mr. Conrad Ashford." The name hung in the air. Even Gideon, who avoided town gossip like the plague, knew Ashford, wealthy, influential, a man whose handshake felt like a trap snapping shut. "You ran from him?" Gideon asked carefully, her breath hitched. "I saw something." He waited. Sheriff Colton was there too. They had a body in the ice house." Her voice cracked. "Old Mr. Whitaker, the one who refused to sell his river land." Gideon stiffened. "They said he fell from his horse," Elara whispered. "But I heard them laughing. I saw the forged deed. They pressed his dead thumb into wax." Tears welled in her eyes. "I screamed. He heard me." The room seemed to shrink. "He grabbed me," she continued, voice shaking harder now. "Said if I spoke a word, he'd make sure I never spoke again." Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat. Gideon's jaw tightened until it ached. "He told the sheriff to post a reward, said I stole jewelry. Said I tried to poison him." A bitter, broken laugh escaped her. "Poison? I can barely boil water." Silence fell heavy. "So you ran," Gideon said. "I didn't stop running." Outside, the last gusts of wind brushed against the cabin like fading ghosts. Gideon stood and walked to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the snow. "They'll be looking," he muttered, her face drained of what little color it had regained. "You don't have to keep me here. I'll leave at first light. I won't drag you into this." He turned slowly. "You step outside in that snow," he said quietly, dangerously. "You won't last an hour." "I'd rather freeze than get you killed," she shot back, tears forming again. Something inside him snapped. "You think I'm afraid of dying?" His voice rumbled like distant thunder. "I've been half dead for 10 years." She stared at him. "I lost my wife to a coward with a gun," he continued, softer now. "I hesitated, thought talking would fix it." A humorless chuckle escaped him. "Ha ha ha, talking." His eyes darkened. "It didn't." Elara's tears fell freely now. "I came up here so I wouldn't have to care about anyone again," he said. "But here you are." Her voice broke. "Why?" He stepped closer, towering but not threatening. "Because if I let them hunt you down," he said quietly, "then I learn nothing." Outside, somewhere down the slope, a branch snapped. Both of them froze. Gideon moved instantly, grabbing his rifle. Elara's breathing quickened. "What was that?" He didn't answer. He moved to the door, listening. Another faint sound, not wind, footsteps. And then a distant glimmer of orange against the snow below, a match being struck. Gideon's voice dropped to a whisper. "They found us." The match burned only a second, but it was enough. A tiny flare of orange in the endless white. Gideon shut the door without a sound and slid the heavy oak bar into place. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, every log suddenly thin as paper. "Elara," he said quietly, already moving, "put out the lamp." She didn't argue. The flame vanished, leaving only the low red glow of the stove. Her hands trembled, but she reached for the lighter carbine he had shown her earlier, more curiosity than training back then. Now it felt like survival. "How many?" she whispered. "Hard to say." He moved to a narrow firing slit he had carved years ago into the back wall. "More than one." Her breath came quick and shallow. Listen to me, he continued, voice steady as stone. If they break through that door, you aim center and squeeze. Don't think, don't pray, just squeeze. She swallowed hard and nodded. Outside, the crunch of boots grew clearer, men who weren't afraid of being heard, confident. A voice carried up the slope. Crow, we know you're in there, Sheriff Colton. Even from this distance, Gideon recognized the oily smugness in the tone. We don't want trouble, the sheriff called out. Just hand over the girl. You can go back to playing hermit. Elara's fingers tightened on the rifle. Gideon leaned toward the slit, sighting down his Winchester. You want her, he roared back. Come take her. The silence that followed was tense, stretched thin. Then movement, three figures advanced from behind boulders, rifles low but ready. Not deputies in clean badges, hired guns and heavy dusters and wide hats, paid wolves. Gideon exhaled slowly, squeezed. The rifle cracked through the night like lightning splitting the sky. The lead man dropped instantly, face first into the snow. Elara gasped. Gunfire exploded in response. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, splintering wood. A shard grazed Gideon's cheek, warm blood trickling down his beard. Elara, stay down. Another shot tore through the chinking above her head. She flinched but didn't scream. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Colton shouted. She's worth 500 alive, dead's cheaper, 500. The number echoed inside the cabin like a curse. Elara's voice shook. I'm not worth that. You are to him, Gideon growled. Another pause, then something new, a hiss, a sputter. Gideon's blood turned to ice. Dynamite, he muttered. What? Elara's voice broke. Before she could process it, a stick with a burning fuse arced through the air toward the porch. Time slowed. Gideon didn't think. He threw the door open and lunged into the snow. Elara, cover me, gunshots whizzed past his ears. He saw the dynamite tumbling, fuse spitting sparks. He swung his rifle like a bat and struck it midair. The explosive sailed back toward the rocks. He dove inside just as boom, the explosion shook the mountain. The blast knocked him flat. The world rang in his ears. Snow cascaded from the roof beams. Smoke and powder filled the air. He lay stunned for a second too, then small hands were gripping his coat. Gideon, Gideon, Elara's voice cracked, almost sobbing. Please, he forced himself up, head spinning. I'm fine, he rasped, though everything hurt. Silence followed the blast, no more gunfire, no shouting. Gideon grabbed his knife and slipped outside, moving like a shadow. Two bodies lay twisted near the crater where the dynamite had detonated prematurely. The third man was gone. A trail of blood stained the snow, leading downhill. He followed it briefly but stopped. The storm clouds were rolling back in. The survivor would make it to town, and when he did, he returned to the cabin. Elara was still clutching the rifle, shaking so violently the barrel trembled. They're gone, he said softly. For now, the words hung unspoken. She stared at him, at the blood on his face, at the smoke curling from his coat. And then she broke, a sob tore out of her, raw and uncontrollable. She dropped the rifle and threw herself into him, gripping his coat like she was drowning. He froze for half a heartbeat, then his arms wrapped around her. He held her tight, her tears soaked into his shirt, and he felt her heart hammering against his chest. You saved me, she whispered, voice shaking. You ran into fire for me. We ain't safe yet, he said quietly, brushing soot from her hair. She pulled back slightly, eyes shining with fear and something else, something warmer. They'll come back, she breathed, not just them. His gaze drifted to the dark horizon. The whole town, if Colton wants it. Her voice was small. Then what do we do? Gideon looked around the cabin, the only home he'd known for a decade, the walls that had kept the world away. It's not a shelter anymore, he said. The realization settled heavy between them. Where? She asked. There's a ridge north of here, he replied slowly. Dead Man's Crest, narrow path, icy, most won't risk it in winter. And us, he met her eyes, we don't have a choice. The wind began to rise again, carrying distant echoes from the valley below. Torches, voices, more than 3 men this time. Elara's fingers found his burned cheek gently. I'm not afraid if I'm with you. He almost laughed, a rough, disbelieving sound. Ha, fate had a cruel sense of humor. 10 years alone, and now in the dead of winter he finally had something to lose. Pack what you can carry, he said firmly. We leave before dawn. Outside, the glow of approaching lanterns flickered like a swarm of fireflies climbing the mountain. The hunt wasn't over, it was just beginning. They left before the sun touched the peaks. The world was blue and silent, the kind of cold that made breath feel like shattered glass in your lungs. Gideon didn't look back at the cabin, not once. 10 years of isolation, of burying memories, of pretending he didn't need anyone, all of it sealed behind that wooden door. Elara walked behind him, bundled in furs too large for her, rifle strapped across her back. Her steps were unsteady but determined. Dead Man's Crest rose ahead like a blade cutting the sky. The climb was brutal, snow swallowed their boots. Ice hid beneath powder like a trap waiting to snap. The wind screamed across the ridge, tugging at their clothes, trying to push them toward the 1,000-foot drop on either side. "Keep your eyes on me," Gideon shouted over the gale. "Not the edge." She nodded, face pale but jaw set. They tied a rope between them, step, step, step. Hours passed like days. By midday, the sky darkened again. Snow began to fall not in flakes, but in needles that stung their skin. Elara stumbled. Gideon caught her before she slid too close to the edge. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her teeth chattered violently. "You're freezing." "So are you." He almost smiled at that. They pressed on, then the wind shifted, carrying something new. Distant voices. Gideon turned carefully, scanning the lower trail. His blood ran cold. A line of riders cut across the slope far below them, more than 10. Sheriff Colton hadn't sent just hired guns this time, he'd brought a posse. "They're gaining," Elara whispered, seeing the dark shapes move like ants through the snow. Gideon's mind raced. If they kept this pace, the posse would reach the base of the ridge by nightfall. "We move faster," he said. The ridge narrowed ahead, no wider than a wagon plank. Ice glazed its surface. One wrong step meant a fall that would never end. The wind howled louder, almost laughing at them. Ha-ha, as if daring them to survive. Elara's foot slipped. For a heartbeat, her body tilted toward the abyss. The rope snapped tight. Gideon dug his boots into the ice, muscles straining, veins standing out in his neck. "Hold on," he roared. She clawed at the rock, sobbing as she fought for purchase. Snow crumbled beneath her hands. I can't, you can." His voice cracked with something deeper than anger. "Look at me," she did, green eyes wide with terror. "Come back to me," he said fiercely. She shifted her weight inch by inch until she collapsed against him. They clung to each other, breathing hard. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Elara let out a shaky laugh that turned into weeping. "I almost fell, but you didn't," he replied, pulling her close. Far below, a gunshot echoed, a warning. The posse had seen them. "We have to go," he said. They pushed forward with renewed desperation. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow descent leading into the northern timberlands, Montana territory. Fewer people, less law, more wilderness. But the descent was worse than the climb. Ice turned the slope into a death slide. Halfway down, a bullet struck the rock near Gideon's boot, spraying shards into his leg. He grunted but kept moving. "They're in range," Elara cried. Gideon turned, raised his rifle, and fired once. A rider toppled from his horse below. The rest scattered for cover. It bought them seconds, not safety. They reached the tree line just as darkness began swallowing the ridge. The forest wrapped around them like a shadowed embrace. Gideon didn't stop until they were deep among the pines. Only then did he lean against a tree, chest heaving. Elara collapsed beside him. "We made it," she whispered, "for now." The words tasted bitter. They had no mule, little food. Limited ammunition, and a dozen armed men tracking them through fresh snow. Elara looked up at him, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. "Regret what? Saving me?" The question hung between them, fragile and heavy. Gideon knelt in front of her, brushing snow from her hair. "I regret a lot of things in my life," he said quietly. "But not you." Tears welled in her eyes again. "Then we keep fighting," she whispered. He nodded. But in the distance, through the trees, lantern light flickered again. They had crossed into Montana, yet the hunt had followed. And this forest, it was about to become a battlefield. The forest swallowed them whole. Tall pines loomed like silent witnesses, their branches heavy with snow. The wind softened here, but the silence felt wrong, too still, too watchful. Gideon crouched, pressing his palm against the snow, fresh tracks behind them, too many. "They split up," he muttered. Elara's breath caught. "They're trying to circle us." He nodded. Sheriff Colton wasn't just angry anymore, he was desperate. Gideon pulled her behind a cluster of thick fir trees and spoke low. We can't outrun horses forever. We need cover, something defensible. There's a trapping cabin near the river, she whispered suddenly. I passed it once when delivering supplies from the ranch. How far? Maybe an hour east if we don't get lost. He didn't hesitate. Lead. They moved fast, weaving through trees, boots crunching in rhythm with racing hearts. Every snap of a twig made Elara flinch. Every distant shout tightened Gideon's jaw, then gunfire. A bullet tore through bark inches from Elara's shoulder. She gasped. Run, Gideon roared. They sprinted downhill, slipping and sliding, branches clawing at their clothes. Another shot rang out. Gideon fired back without breaking stride. The forest erupted with shouts. There. They're heading east. The river came into view, half frozen, water snarling beneath a skin of ice. And there it was, a small log cabin, smoke faintly curling from its chimney. Occupied, Gideon slowed, suspicion tightening his features. Who lives here? He demanded. An old trapper. His name's Rowan Hale. He used to trade with Ashford. That wasn't comforting. They reached the door just as hoofbeats echoed behind them. Gideon pounded on the wood. Rowan, open up. Silence. Then the door cracked open. A gaunt older man with sharp gray eyes stared out, rifle in hand. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. The mountain bear himself. Rowan, Gideon said urgently, we need shelter. The old man's gaze flicked to Elara, recognition flashing. So the rumors are true. Hoofbeats grew louder. Rowan hesitated only a second before stepping aside. Get in. They stumbled inside. Warmth hit them like a blessing. Elara nearly collapsed from relief. Rowan barred the door and moved to the window. You've got half of Wyoming behind you. Montana now, Gideon corrected grimly. That sheriff don't care about borders. Gunshots struck the cabin walls. Rowan cursed under his breath. You brought hell with you. They were already coming, Gideon replied. Elara grabbed Gideon's arm. They'll burn it like they tried before. Rowan's eyes darkened. Over my dead body. The posse surrounded the clearing quickly. Lantern light glowed through the cracks in the logs. Sheriff Colton's voice rang out. Rowan Hale, you harbor fugitives, you hang with them. Rowan spat on the floor. Man's been threatening me for years, ain't new. Gideon moved beside him. We can't let them torch this place. Rowan nodded toward the back wall. There's a root cellar hatch, leads to the riverbank. Ice is thin but passable on foot. Risky. Elara's voice shook. And you? Rowan gave a dry, almost amused chuckle. I'm too old to run, ha, but I ain't too old to shoot. No, Gideon said firmly, we don't leave you. You don't have time to argue. The first torch hit the roof. Smoke began to curl downward. Gunfire erupted again, splintering wood. Rowan returned fire with surprising precision, dropping a man near the tree line. Gideon grabbed Elara's hand. Go, Rowan ordered. Before they rushed the door, tears streamed down Elara's face. Thank you, Rowan gave her a brief nod. Live long enough to make it worth it. Flames licked along the shingles. Gideon pulled up the cellar hatch. Cold air rushed in. He helped Elara down into darkness just as the front door burst inward. Shouts, chaos, gunshots, Rowan's final roar echoed above them, then a deafening blast. The cabin shook violently. Elara covered her ears, sobbing. Keep moving, Gideon said, voice raw. They crawled through the narrow tunnel until icy water shimmered ahead. The river, night had fully fallen now. Behind them, the cabin burned like a funeral pyre, sparks flying into the dark sky. Gideon looked back once. Rowan Hale had made his stand, and the hunt had just turned personal. Elara squeezed his hand tightly. They'll never stop. Gideon's eyes hardened, reflecting firelight. Then we stopped them. The frozen river stretched ahead, thin ice cracking softly under the weight of their first step. And somewhere behind the flames, Sheriff Colton was still alive, still hunting. But he had no idea the prey was about to become the predator. The river groaned beneath them. Each step across the thin ice sent sharp cracks spidering outward, the sound slicing through the night like broken glass. Elara's fingers were locked around Gideon's, her knuckles white, her breathing ragged. Don't look down, he murmured. Too late, through the cloudy ice she could see black water rushing beneath, fast, hungry, unforgiving. Behind them, Rowan's cabin burned fiercely, flames snapping and roaring into the dark sky. Gunshots echoed in the distance, confused shouts mixing with the chaos. The posse hadn't expected the explosion. For a moment they were scattered, but it wouldn't last. Halfway across, the ice dipped. A sharp crack split the air. Elara gasped as her boot punched through, plunging into the freezing river. She cried out not just from the cold, but from fear so raw it tore straight from her chest. Gideon dropped instantly, hauling her upward before the ice could give way further. Water soaked her leg, freezing instantly in the night air. "Move," he barked, lifting her partly off her feet and dragging her toward the far bank. The ice groaned again but held. They stumbled onto solid ground just as a lantern glow flickered at the river's edge behind them. "They're following," Elara cried. Gideon didn't look back. He hoisted her onto his shoulder without hesitation and ran into the trees. Branches whipped at his face. His burned wrists screamed in pain with every jolt, but he didn't slow. After what felt like miles, he finally stopped beneath a dense thicket of evergreens. He set her down carefully. Her soaked leg was already stiffening from cold. He knelt and tore strips from his own shirt, wrapping her tightly. His hands were rough, trembling slightly, not from weakness but fury. "You're shaking," she whispered. "So are you." She tried to laugh, but it came out broken, almost weeping. "Ha ha ha, this isn't how I imagined Montana." He looked at her then, really looked. Soot still smudged her cheeks. Strands of copper hair clung to her damp face, but her eyes, they weren't helpless anymore, they were fierce. In the distance, hoofbeats approached the riverbank. "They'll test the ice," Gideon muttered, "and when it breaks," as if summoned by his words, crack, a horse screamed, men shouted. Another violent crack echoed through the night, followed by splashing and curses swallowed by icy water. Elara covered her mouth, horrified. "They'll lose a few," Gideon said grimly. "But not enough." The sheriff would not turn back because of casualties. Colton wanted blood, yours and mine. Gideon stood slowly, eyes scanning the forest. "There's a ravine half a mile north, narrow, only one way in." "A trap?" she asked. "A stand," her heart skipped. "You're not running anymore," she realized. He looked at her, jaw set. "No," she rose too, though her injured leg wobbled. "You can't fight them alone." A faint, humorless chuckle escaped him. "Ha ha ha, I never planned to." For a second she just stared at him, then she lifted her rifle. "Then teach me the rest." Something inside him shifted, pride, fear, love, though he dared not name it yet. He positioned her carefully, correcting her stance despite the cold biting into both of them. "You aim low in the dark," he instructed quietly. "Lantern light blinds them, not you." Voices grew closer through the trees. The posse had crossed elsewhere. Sheriff Colton's voice rose above the rest, furious and sharp. "Spread out, they can't be far." Elara's breathing steadied. Gideon squeezed her shoulder once. "Whatever happens," he said low, "you don't stop." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. Boots crunched in the snow. A lantern beam cut through the branches. A deputy stepped into view. Gideon didn't hesitate. The rifle roared. The man dropped. Chaos erupted. Gunfire tore through the trees. Bark exploded around them. Lanterns swung wildly. "Elara," Gideon shouted. She fired and hit. The look on her face, shock, horror, and survival, flashed in the firelight. Ha ha ha, she wasn't nobody anymore. She was fighting. Colton's voice rang out again. "Crowe, this ends tonight." Gideon reloaded calmly, eyes blazing. Yes, he growled under his breath, it would end, but not the way the sheriff imagined. Because in this dark forest, under a sky that had witnessed too much blood already, the mountain bear was done running, and the next shot would change everything. The forest exploded into noise. Gunfire cracked through the trees, lanterns swinging wildly as men scrambled for cover. Smoke drifted low between the trunks, stinging eyes and throats. Elara fired again. The recoil bruised her shoulder, but she didn't cry out. A deputy spun and fell behind a stump, his lantern rolling into the snow. Gideon moved like something born of the wilderness, silent, precise, terrifying. He changed positions after every shot, never staying where the muzzle flash betrayed him. "Circle them," Sheriff Colton shouted. "Flush them out." "They're already flushed," Gideon muttered darkly. A bullet grazed his upper arm. Warm blood soaked through his sleeve. He barely reacted. Elara saw it. "You're hit, still breathing." The words were sharp but not cruel. The posse pressed closer, emboldened by numbers. They had rifles, shotguns, horses tethered back by the river. They believed they had cornered two desperate fugitives. They didn't realize desperation could turn into something far worse. A lantern beam locked onto Elara. "There she is." She froze for half a second, fear clawing up her spine. Gideon saw it. No, he roared. He stepped into the open and fired twice in rapid succession. The lantern shattered. The man behind it dropped, but stepping into the open cost him. 3 rifles cracked at once. One bullet tore through his side. Another slammed into his thigh. He staggered but didn't fall. Elara screamed his name, a raw, broken sound that echoed through the ravine. Gideon, he dropped to one knee, breath ripping from his chest. Sheriff Colton emerged from behind a pine, revolver drawn, a cruel smile spreading beneath his mustache. "It's over, Crowe," he sneered. "You should have stayed alone on that mountain." Elara raised her rifle, hands shaking violently. Colton noticed. He aimed at her instead. "Drop it, girl, or watch him die slow." Time slowed. Snow drifted softly between them. Gideon forced himself upright despite the blood pouring down his leg. "Elara," he rasped. Her eyes met his, and in them she saw something steady, not fear, trust. She squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out like judgment. Colton's revolver fired at the same instant, but Alara's bullet struck first. The sheriff's chest jerked backward, eyes widening in disbelief. He staggered, dropped the gun, and collapsed into the snow. Silence fell heavy and stunned. The remaining deputies hesitated. Their leader lay motionless. Gideon lifted his rifle once more, even as blood soaked into the white beneath him. "Leave," he growled, voice low and deadly, "or join him." The men looked at each other. One dropped his weapon. Another backed away slowly. Within seconds, the forest began to empty. Boots retreated. Lanterns vanished. The hunt dissolved into cowardice. Elara ran to Gideon, dropping beside him in the snow. Her hands pressed against his wounds, trembling violently. "No, no, no, stay with me," she whispered, tears falling fast. "Please don't you dare leave me." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a weak, breathless sound. "Ha ha ha, you shoot better than I do." "This isn't funny." He reached up, brushing her cheek with shaking fingers. "You didn't run," he murmured. "You taught me not to." Her sob broke free then, uncontrollable. He leaned his forehead against hers. "I'm not done yet," he said softly. "You hear me." But his strength was fading, blood loss, cold. Exhaustion. Elara looked around desperately. "We need shelter now." The ravine walls loomed around them, and in the shadows behind a cluster of boulders she spotted something, a narrow cave opening, small, hidden hope. She slid beneath his arm, hauling him up with strength she didn't know she possessed. "You carried me," she whispered fiercely. "Now it's my turn." Step by painful step, she dragged him toward the cave. Behind them, Sheriff Colton lay still in the snow. The tyrant of the valley, gone, but the night was far from over, because inside that cave, Gideon Crowe's life hung by a thread. And Elara was about to fight for him the way he had fought for her. The cave was barely more than a crack in the rock face, but it was dry. Dry meant life. Elara dragged Gideon inside inch by inch, her boots slipping in snow soaked red behind them. Her arms burned, her injured legs screamed, but she didn't stop. "Stay with me," she kept whispering. "Stay with me." He tried to respond, but only a low groan escaped him. Inside, the cave opened just enough to shield them from the wind. The cold still crept in, but it no longer bit like knives. Elara laid him down carefully. His blood was everywhere. Her hands shook violently as she tore open his coat. The bullet wound in his side was ugly, dark, and deep. The one in his thigh bled heavily. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, panic rising like floodwater in her chest. Gideon's eyes fluttered open. "You do," he rasped faintly. "You survived Ashford, you survived the ridge, you survived tonight." Tears streamed down her face. "Don't talk like that." He gave a faint, broken chuckle. "Ha ha ha, you're stronger than you think." His head lolled slightly. "No," she slapped his cheek lightly. "Look at me." He forced his gaze back to her. "Good," she breathed shakily. She remembered watching ranch hands treat injuries, burn cloth. "Stop bleeding, remove what you can reach." Her hands worked clumsily but determined. She bit down on a strip of leather and pressed it between his teeth. "This is going to hurt," she warned, voice trembling. He managed a faint smirk. "Been hurt before." She dug the knife tip carefully into the wound in his thigh. He roared, a raw animal sound that filled the cave. She almost dropped the blade. "Don't stop," he gasped. Her tears fell onto his skin as she worked. Finally, the bullet came free. She pressed cloth against the wound hard, ignoring his strangled groan. The bleeding slowed. The side wound was worse. She couldn't reach the bullet safely. So she packed it tightly, binding it with every scrap of cloth she had left. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the bleeding eased. She slumped back against the cave wall, shaking uncontrollably. He was pale, too pale. Gideon, she whispered, brushing his hair back gently, you promised me. His breathing was shallow but steady. Outside, the wind howled again, carrying distant shouts. The posse hadn't returned yet, but they would regroup. They would search at first light. Elara wiped her tears roughly. She couldn't collapse. Not now. She crawled toward the cave entrance and carefully pulled loose branches and snow across it, disguising the opening. When she returned, Gideon's eyes were half closed. Don't you dare, she whispered fiercely. His lips moved faintly. What? She asked, leaning close. You shot him, he murmured weakly. Sheriff, her chest tightened. Yes, you ended it. She didn't feel triumph, only exhaustion. They'll still come, she said softly. Maybe, he replied. But without him, they're just scared men. Silence filled the cave, then he looked at her differently, not as someone he was protecting, but as an equal. You saved me, he whispered, her breath hitched. You saved me first. A fragile smile touched his lips. Guess we're even. She leaned down, resting her forehead gently against his. I don't want to be even, she whispered. I want you alive. His hand found hers weakly. You're not nobody, he murmured. Remember that. Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Outside, the forest quieted slowly. The night deepened. Elara pulled the last blanket around them and curled against him, sharing warmth, listening to his breathing like it was the only sound in the world. But as the hours passed, his breaths grew slower, fainter, and just before dawn, when the sky turned pale gray beyond the cave mouth, he stopped moving. Elara, his voice was barely air, her heart shattered. I'm here. He looked at her one last time and whispered something that made her break completely, because what he said next would change everything. I love you. The words were barely breath, barely sound. But they struck her harder than any bullet ever could. Elara froze. For a moment the world disappeared, the snow, the blood, the hunt, the fear. There was only him, his pale face, his fading strength, his eyes still burning beneath the pain. No, she whispered, shaking her head fiercely. No, you don't get to say that like it's goodbye. A faint smile touched his lips, weak, beautiful, heartbreaking. Ha ha ha, it was barely a ghost of a laugh. Bossy to the end, she pressed her forehead against his, tears spilling freely. You don't get to leave me, she said, voice breaking. You promised, you said we'd walk out of this. His fingers tightened faintly around hers. Then help me walk, that did it. Something inside her shifted, not fear, not grief. Resolve. He wasn't gone, he was fighting, so she would too. You stay awake, she ordered, wiping her face roughly. You hear me. Talk to me, about what? He murmured faintly. About your wife. Silence. Pain flickered through his eyes, but he answered. Her name was Miriam. The name carried weight, memory, regret. She liked sunflowers, he continued slowly. Laughed loud, too loud. A fragile smile trembled on his lips. Ha ha ha, I used to pretend it annoyed me. Elara swallowed hard. You loved her. Always will. The honesty didn't hurt her the way she expected. It made her chest ache in a different way. And you still chose to fight for me, she whispered. You weren't replacing her, he rasped. You were reminding me. Her heart cracked open completely. Reminding you of what? That I was still alive. His breathing hitched, her panic flared again. No, 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 stay with me. She shifted quickly, pulling him closer, sharing what little warmth she had left. The eastern sky began to lighten faintly outside the cave. Dawn, with it would come searchers. They couldn't stay hidden much longer. She looked at his wounds again. The bleeding had slowed, that was something. She grabbed snow and pressed it gently against his fevered forehead. Cold, he muttered weakly. Good, she forced herself to think. There had to be a settlement nearby, a trading outpost, a hunter's shack, something. If she could get help, but leaving him alone felt like a death sentence. A distant shout echoed through the trees, her blood ran cold. They're searching, she whispered. Gideon's eyes opened slightly. Go, he breathed, her head snapped toward him. What if they find you? It's over. I'm not leaving you. You have to. No, her voice was steel. I didn't cross a frozen river, shoot a sheriff, and stitch you back together just to abandon you now. A faint spark of pride flickered in his eyes. Stubborn woman. Yes, she snapped, tears rising again, because you made me one. Another shout, closer this time. She grabbed his rifle and checked the chamber. 2 rounds left, not enough, but it would have to do. She moved toward the cave entrance slowly and peered through the branches. Three men moved cautiously through the trees, not as confident as before, not as loud. Fear had crept into their steps. Good. She turned back to Gideon. You trust me? She asked, his gaze locked onto hers. Always. Her throat tightened. Then let me finish this. She slipped outside silently, rifle raised. The forest held its breath. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Elara wasn't running, she was hunting. The snow was still fresh enough to swallow sound. Elara moved low between the trees, every breath steady despite the storm inside her chest. The men were spreading out now, rifles raised, boots crunching softly. Check the rocks, one muttered nervously. He's wounded, can't be far. He not we. They still saw Gideon as the threat. Good. Elara positioned herself behind a fallen pine trunk and steadied her rifle. Her hands didn't shake this time. The first man stepped into view, lantern held high. She fired. The shot cracked through the forest, dropping him instantly. The other two spun around, panic flashing across their faces. Ambush, they fired blindly into the trees. Splinters exploded near her cheek. She rolled aside, heart hammering but mind clear, one round left. The second man rushed forward recklessly, shouting curses. She waited, waited. He came within 10 yards. She fired. He fell hard into the snow. Silence. Only one remained. The third man backed away slowly, terror written across his face. I don't want this, he shouted hoarsely. Sheriff's dead, it's over. Elara stepped into view, rifle now empty but held steady. Then leave, she said coldly. He stared at her, at the small woman covered in blood and snow, at the bodies of his companions, at the fire in her eyes. He dropped his weapon and ran. She didn't chase him. The forest swallowed him whole. For a long moment she stood there, chest rising and falling, the weight of what she had done settling into her bones. No laughter now, no tears, just survival. She turned and ran back toward the cave. Gideon, she breathed as she slipped inside. He was still alive, barely conscious. I told you, she whispered, kneeling beside him. You should have been more afraid of me. A faint sound escaped him, something between a breath and a laugh. Ha ha ha, relief crashed over her so hard she nearly collapsed. They're gone, she said softly, all of them. His eyes fluttered open. Colton, dead. He closed his eyes again, not in surrender, but in release. It's finished, he murmured. She wanted to believe that, but survival was only half the battle. You're not dying here, she said firmly. There's a settlement east of the ridge. I remember traders talking about it. We're getting you there. He tried to protest. She silenced him with a look. You carried me, she reminded him. She tore branches into a crude sled and used her belt and rope scraps to fashion a harness. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It just needed to move. Step by painful step, she dragged him through the forest. The sun climbed slowly, pale and indifferent. Hours passed. Her muscles screamed. Her injured leg throbbed. Her lungs burned, but she didn't stop. Because every time she looked back at him, she remembered his words. You're not nobody. By late afternoon, smoke appeared through the trees, real smoke from chimneys. Hope hit her so suddenly she almost sobbed. She stumbled forward and shouted. Help, please! Figures emerged cautiously from between wooden buildings. Men with rifles, women shielding children, strangers. She collapsed to her knees as they approached. He's alive, she begged. Please help him. They lifted Gideon carefully and rushed him toward the largest cabin. Voices overlapped. Get the doctor, hot water, bandages. Elara tried to follow, but her vision blurred. Someone caught her before she hit the ground. It's all right, a woman's voice soothed gently. You're safe, safe. The word felt strange. Hours later, she sat outside the small infirmary, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Snow began to fall softly again, but this time it felt different. Not cruel, not hunting, just quiet. The door creaked open. An older man stepped out, wiping his hands. Well, he said calmly, he's stubborn. Her breath caught. He's going to live. The sob that tore out of her was loud and uncontrollable. She covered her face, weeping openly. Ha ha ha, it wasn't funny. It was relief so deep it hurt. The door opened again. Gideon stood there, pale, supported by the doorframe, but alive, very much alive. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange they both understood. The mountain hadn't broken them. The hunt hadn't ended them. It had forged them. And this was only the beginning. Gideon shouldn't have been standing. The doctor had insisted he rest for days, maybe weeks. But stubbornness ran deeper in him than the bullets ever had. He leaned against the door frame, pale but upright, one arm braced, the other wrapped tightly in clean bandages. Elara stared at him as if she were seeing a ghost rise from its grave. "You're supposed to be in bed," she whispered, voice still raw from crying. He managed a crooked half-smile. "Never liked being told what to do." She crossed the distance between them quickly, almost angrily, and pressed her hands against his chest as if confirming he was real. "You almost died," she breathed. "So did you." Silence fell heavy between them, not awkward but full. The small Montana settlement had already heard the news. Word traveled fast in places where nothing ever happened. Sheriff Colton was dead. Ashford's corruption was exposed. The forged deed recovered from his office, Elara had insisted on bringing it when they fled the ranch weeks ago, was now in the hands of honest men. For the first time since this nightmare began, the law was not hunting them. It was hunting someone else. Inside the infirmary, the doctor cleared his throat. "He needs rest." Elara shot Gideon a warning look. He sighed softly. "Bossy, ha ha ha," she replied faintly through tears. "You love that about me." He didn't deny it. That evening the townsfolk gathered quietly near the main hall. They weren't loud, they weren't dramatic, but they were grateful. One older rancher approached Elara. "Whitaker was my cousin," he said quietly. "We always knew something wasn't right about that fall." Her throat tightened. "You did what we were too afraid to," he added, afraid. That word carried weight because she had been afraid too, terrified, and she had done it anyway. Later, when the town quieted and lanterns dimmed, Elara returned to Gideon's bedside. He looked smaller without his heavy coat, vulnerable, human. She sat beside him and brushed her fingers gently across his bandaged side. "You could stay here," she said softly. "They'd welcome you." He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "For years," he murmured, "I thought the mountain was the only place I belonged. And now," his gaze shifted to her, "now I think maybe it was just waiting for you." Her breath caught. "You don't owe me," she said quietly. "You don't have to build a life around saving someone." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't save you because I had to," he said. "I saved you because I wanted to." A tear slipped down her cheek. "And you didn't stay with me because you had nowhere else to go," he added. "You stayed because you chose to." She nodded. "I did." Outside, snow fell gently under moonlight. The hunt was over, the war was over. But something else was beginning. A new question hung quietly between them. "What now?" She leaned closer. "Take me back to the mountains," she whispered. He studied her carefully. "That life isn't easy." "Neither is this one," she replied softly. He reached for her hand, his fingers still weak but steady. "Higher up," he said, "where no sheriff rides." She smiled through tears. "And no one calls me nobody." "Never again." She rested her forehead against his. For the first time since the storm that started it all, there was no fear in the silence, only peace. But as the wind moved through the pines beyond the settlement, it carried something else too, a whisper of unfinished business. Because Ashford was still alive, and men like him didn't forgive easily, Ashford did not take humiliation quietly. News of Sheriff Colton's death reached him within days. Word spread even faster that the forged deed had been handed over to federal marshals passing through Montana. Witness statements were being gathered, names whispered in courtrooms. For the first time in years, Conrad Ashford felt something unfamiliar. Fear, but fear in a man like him did not turn into regret, it turned into rage. "He's alive," Ashford snarled when one of his ranch hands confirmed Gideon Crowe had survived. "Yes, sir, in a northern settlement." "Word is the girl's with him." The girl. He slammed his glass against the wall. Brandy splattered across polished wood. "She was supposed to freeze on that mountain." "She didn't." Silence fell heavy in the study. Ashford paced slowly, mind racing. Colton had been useful, corrupt, predictable, loyal to money. Now he was dead, which meant Ashford stood alone and exposed. "Get me men," he said finally. "Quiet ones. Not fools. You're riding north yourself," the ranch hand asked carefully. Ashford's jaw tightened. "If Crow breathes long enough to testify, everything I built burns." Meanwhile, far north, Gideon healed slowly. The settlement's doctor had done what he could. The bullet from his side remained inside, too risky to remove, but infection had been beaten back. He walked with a cane now, hated it. Elara noticed every grimace he tried to hide. "You push too hard," she said one morning as he practiced stepping outside. "And you worry too much," he shot back gently. She crossed her arms. You think Ashford will just disappear? His silence answered her. They both knew the truth. Men like Ashford didn't accept defeat, they retaliated. That evening, a rider arrived breathless from the south. He's mobilizing, the rider warned the settlement leaders. Ashford's hiring guns headed this direction, murmurs spread quickly. Elara felt her stomach drop. Gideon's jaw set. He's desperate, Gideon said quietly. That makes him dangerous. The settlement offered protection. Men volunteered to stand guard, but Gideon shook his head. He's not coming for them, he said. He's coming for us. Alara's eyes locked with his. You're not running again. No, the word held weight, finality. Then we end it, she whispered. That night, beneath a sky streaked with cold stars, they made a decision. They would not wait inside wooden walls hoping Ashford changed his mind. They would meet him. On ground Gideon knew better than any man alive, the mountains. At dawn they prepared quietly. The settlement tried to argue. You've done enough, one elder insisted. Let the law handle it. Gideon's expression hardened. The law failed once. Elara stepped beside him. It won't fail again, she said softly, but we won't hide while we wait. The wind carried a familiar chill as they rode south toward the lower ridges, the same mountains that had nearly killed them, the same mountains that had saved them. Elara glanced at Gideon as they climbed. No more running, she said. He looked at her, eyes steady. No more. Far below, on a separate trail, Ashford rode with 6 hired guns. Snow kicked up beneath their horses. His face was pale with fury. He didn't want justice. He wanted revenge. And by nightfall, Hunter and Hunted would stand face to face one final time. Because this time, only one side would walk off that mountain alive. The mountains welcomed them back with silence. No storm this time, no blind chaos, just cold, steady air and the long shadows of late afternoon stretching across snow-covered ridges. Gideon dismounted near a narrow pass carved between 2 cliffs of dark granite. This is where we wait, he said quietly. Elara studied the terrain, high ground, limited approach, rock cover. You planned this before, she realized. He gave a small nod. Up here, numbers don't matter as much. She adjusted the rifle strap across her shoulder. I don't want to kill again, she admitted softly. He looked at her. You won't, he said. Unless you have to. Hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. Ashford wasn't subtle. He rode with confidence, convinced money made him untouchable. As the hired guns came into view below, Ashford raised a gloved hand. There, one of the men muttered, up on the ridge. Ashford narrowed his eyes. Gideon Crowe stood silhouetted against the pale sky, not hiding, not retreating, waiting. Elara stood beside him. Ashford dismounted slowly. So the mountain bear still lives, he called upward mockingly. And you brought my property with you. Elara's jaw tightened, but she didn't react. She was never yours, Gideon replied calmly. Ashford smiled thinly. You think killing a sheriff makes you righteous? You're nothing but a murderer. Gideon's voice didn't rise. He tried to burn me alive, and I would have finished the job. The honesty of it made the air heavier. Ashford motioned to his men. They began spreading out, rifles raised. Last chance, Ashford called. Send her down and I might let you limp away. Elara stepped forward. I saw you forge that deed, she shouted clearly. I saw the body in the ice house. Ashford's smile faltered just for a flicker. You saw nothing, he snapped. Gideon's eyes never left him. She'll testify, Ashford's face twisted. You think courts matter up here? No, Gideon replied quietly. But the truth does. Ashford drew his pistol. The hired guns followed suit. Snow shifted under boots. Wind whispered through the pass. Time stretched thin. Then gunfire erupted. The first hired gun dropped from Gideon's shot. Elara fired immediately after, hitting another before he could aim. The pass exploded with echoes. Bullets ricocheted off stone. Ashford ducked behind a boulder, shouting orders that no one fully obeyed. His men weren't fighting for loyalty. They were fighting for pay, and pay didn't feel worth dying for. One by one, Gideon's precision and the narrow terrain took them down or forced retreat. Within minutes, only Ashford remained, breathing hard, alone. He fired wildly toward the ridge. His shot struck Gideon's cane, splintering it. Gideon didn't flinch. He stepped down from the ridge slowly, rifle steady. Elara followed. Ashford stumbled backward in disbelief. You're just a hermit, he shouted, voice cracking. You think this makes you a hero? Gideon stopped 10 feet away. No, he said simply, it makes me finished. Ashford lunged suddenly, firing again. The bullet grazed Gideon's shoulder. Elara reacted instantly. She tackled Gideon aside as Ashford rushed forward recklessly. He slipped on ice, just for a second. Gideon rose despite the pain and drove into him. The two men crashed into the snow. Ashford swung wildly, desperate, panicked. You ruined everything, he screamed. You ruined it yourself, Gideon growled. The fight was short. Ashford wasn't built for real struggle. Gideon pinned him easily. Elara grabbed the fallen pistol and aimed steadily. Ashford froze. For the first time, true fear filled his eyes. Wait, he whispered, no arrogance, no mockery, just fear. Gideon looked at Elara. She understood this wasn't about vengeance. It was about ending it. Bind him, she said calmly. Ashford stared in disbelief as Gideon tied his hands tightly. You're not killing me, he croaked. No, Gideon replied, you're going to answer. Ashford sagged, defeated. By nightfall, they rode back north with Ashford bound behind them. Not as fugitives, but as witnesses. The mountain wind carried no anger now, only quiet. And as Elara rode beside Gideon, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Freedom. The war was over. But the story wasn't quite finished yet. The ride back felt different, not rushed, not hunted. Ashford's wrists were bound tight, rope cutting into skin that had never known real hardship. He rode stiffly, eyes fixed on the ground, arrogance stripped away mile by mile. Elara watched him once, just once, and felt no triumph, only closure. When they reached the Montana settlement, word spread faster than wildfire. They had brought him alive, men gathered, women stepped out of homes quietly, children peered from behind skirts. Gideon dismounted slowly, wincing but steady. He dragged Ashford forward and untied him only long enough to shove him toward the town marshal. This man forged deeds, ordered murder, and tried to silence a witness, Gideon said simply. No shouting, no grand speech, just truth. Ashford tried to speak. No proof, Elara stepped forward. I saw you, she said clearly. The forged document was produced, signatures examined, witnesses came forward, and for the first time Ashford found himself without control, without influence, without protection. The marshal nodded once. We'll hold him for federal transport. Ashford's eyes darted wildly between faces. You think this changes anything? He spat at Gideon. Men like me always rise again. Gideon leaned in close. Not this time. Ashford was dragged away. And just like that, the shadow that had loomed over valleys and mountains for years was gone. Silence settled, not fearful silence, peaceful silence. The kind that follows a storm finally passing. Later that evening, as the settlement returned to quiet routine, Gideon stood outside beneath a sky heavy with stars. Elara joined him. You could stay, she said softly. They'd make you marshal if you wanted. He chuckled faintly. How imagine that, she smiled. But you won't. He looked toward the distant outline of the higher peaks. No, she stepped closer, higher up, higher up. For a long moment they simply stood there, no chase, no gunfire, no fear. Just the sound of wind moving gently through pine branches. You ever think, she asked quietly, that if the storm hadn't come early, if I hadn't found your cabin, I'd still be alone, he answered honestly. And I'd be dead, he didn't deny it. Instead, he reached for her hand. Funny thing about mountains, he said, they don't change for anyone. She squeezed his fingers gently. But people do. He looked at her then, not as someone broken, not as someone he saved, but as someone who saved him back. Ready? He asked. She nodded. They left before dawn the next morning. No ceremony, no applause. Just two horses, two rifles, and a quiet promise between them. The trail back into the Absaroka range felt familiar but no longer lonely. Snow crunched softly under hooves. The air grew thinner, cleaner. By midday, they reached a higher clearing, untouched, hidden, protected by granite walls and pine. Gideon dismounted and looked around. This'll do. Elara stepped beside him, eyes shining. No one will find us here unless we want them to. He nodded. Together they began rebuilding, not just a cabin, a life. Days turned into weeks. The scars on Gideon's body faded to thin silver lines. The bruises on Elara's wrists disappeared entirely. Laughter began filling the quiet mountain air. Real laughter, ha-ha, not bitter, not hollow, alive. And sometimes, when the wind swept down the ridges at dusk, it carried the sound of their voices through the trees. Not of a hunted man and a frightened girl, but of two souls who chose to fight and chose to stay. And high in the Wyoming mountains, long after the gunfire faded and the law settled its books, there stood a cabin no storm could break. Because it wasn't built on fear, it was built on love. Spring came slowly to the high peaks. Snow melted in silver threads down the granite slopes. The river below no longer groaned beneath ice, it sang. Pine needles shimmered in soft sunlight, and wildflowers began pushing bravely through the thawing earth. The new cabin stood stronger than the last, higher, wiser, built not as a hiding place but as a home. Elara stepped outside one morning with flour dust on her hands, laughing as Gideon wrestled with a stubborn roof beam. "You're hammering it like it insulted you," she teased. "It did," he grumbled, then glanced at her and smiled despite himself. "Ha ha ha, stubborn wood." She crossed the clearing and steadied the ladder for him. Months ago she had arrived here starving and hunted. Now her cheeks were full with color. Her shoulders strong, her eyes no longer darted at every sound. Gideon climbed down carefully, still favoring his legs slightly, and looked at her with quiet pride. "You're different," he said. "So are you." He tilted his head. "You laugh more," she smiled softly. "So do you." The mountain wind passed gently between them, no longer carrying threats. News had reached them through passing trappers. Ashford had stood trial. The evidence held. Witnesses spoke. He would spend the rest of his life behind iron bars, far from the valleys he once controlled. Justice, not perfect, but enough. That evening they sat outside beneath a sky painted in orange and gold. Elara rested her head against Gideon's shoulder. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. Being alone, he thought about it honestly, the silence, the isolation, the safety of not caring. Then he looked at her. "No," she exhaled slowly. "Good." A long pause followed, peaceful, unhurried. "I used to think surviving was the same as living," she admitted softly. He nodded. "It isn't." "No." They sat like that until the first stars appeared. After a while she looked up at him. "When you found me," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "why didn't you throw me back into the snow?" He let out a low breath. "Because when I saw you there," he paused, searching for the truth. "It felt like the mountain was asking me a question." She looked at him curiously. "What question? Are you going to hide forever, or are you going to fight for something again?" Her eyes filled slightly. "And you chose to fight." "I chose you." The words settled deep between them. No storm interrupted, no gunfire followed, just wind through pine trees and the soft rhythm of two hearts steady and alive. In the years that followed, travelers sometimes spoke of a couple high in the Absaroka range. A broad-shouldered man with a scar and a steady gaze. A woman with copper hair and fearless green eyes. They said if you lost your way in those mountains, you might find smoke rising from a chimney higher than expected. If you knocked politely, you'd be offered warmth, food, and perhaps a quiet story by firelight. But you'd never hear the full truth of what happened that winter. You'd only notice how the man watched the woman when she laughed, and how the woman rested her hand over the man's heart as if guarding something precious. The mountains did not change. Storms still came, snow still buried trails, but that cabin stood firm through it all because it wasn't built on escape, it was built on choice. And sometimes, when the wind howled fiercely at night, Gideon would pull Elara closer and whisper softly against her hair, "Not alone anymore." And she would smile into his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and strong, and whisper back, "Never again."